Hello, everyone. Excellent, thank you. So on behalf of the Economics Department of the University of Manchester, thank you very much for coming in so good numbers for this, what should be a super interesting talk. I will just do the admin stuff. So firstly, there's no fire alarm planned. So if the fire alarm goes off, it's not time for panic, but time to leave quietly, okay? The toilets are outside on the corridor. Just a note, there's filming done. We had a note on the outside as well. And then the last thing I have to do is to introduce Professor Nicolas from the London School of Economics. He has a long history of advising governments, not only this government, on student finance and, in fact, on pension. So you'll possibly see the theme. He's bookending our work life. So thank you very much for coming, Nicolas, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Ralph, for that introduction. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here. As Ralph said, my name is Nicolas Barr. I'm Professor of Public Economics at the London School of Economics. I've been there since shortly after Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee. One of the lovely things about being an academic is you can be very rude about government policy. And with one exception, I've been very rude about British government's higher education policy going back as far as the 1980s, but we can tease out later what it is about their policies that I disagree with. Huge areas of debate. People say higher education should be free, it's immoral to charge for education, higher education is a basic right and should therefore be free, and tuition fees harm access is one side of the debate. And the other half says that if it's immoral to charge for education, why is it not immoral to charge for food? I don't know if any of you have been demonstrating outside Sainsbury's or Tesco's because it's immoral to charge for food because without it people would die. So there's stuff to be unpacked in there. Fees harm access. I think what you're going to hear from Jack today is that access is much more complicated than just fees. A lot of it depends on prior education, prior attainment, including the quality of A-level results. For those of you who are here doing A-levels, go for it, get the best results you possibly can. And you could say, since most people who go to university are still mainly from better off backgrounds, you could say that free higher education is a middle-class rip-off. So you've got a genuine and important debate. And that's a debate I've been involved with. I do the analytics, I don't do the numbers. And when it comes to numbers, the Institute for Fiscal Studies does numbers that are as good as it gets. Their numbers are terrific, and I pillage them ruthlessly, but always say where I've got my numbers from. And so you couldn't have a better speaker today than Jack Britton, who is Senior Research Economist at the Institute for Fiscal Study. He leads the program of research on higher education. He's written widely on higher education finance, helping to clarify the debate by highlighting the implications of successive changes, good and bad, in British government policy. He's also leading an exciting new initiative organised by the Institute for Fiscal Studies on the returns of different degrees using administrative data. So these are data that show what actually happens to people from which you can work out the returns to different degrees. And he has won a prize for the best economics writing from the Society of Professional Economists. As some of you are painfully aware, good writing by economists is very rare. Jack is one of those who can write. So I think that you're in for a treat. Jack, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Nick. So looking around this room, I can see that I'm in a significant minority when I say that I can remember 1998. It was the year I started secondary school. It was the year Nottingham Forest romped to the First Division title with Pierre Van Hooijdonk up front. And it was the year David Beckham was sent off for kicking Diego Simeone in the last 16 of the World Cup. It was also the year well, although I don't actually remember it because I was only 11, that tuition fees were first introduced in England. They're only £1,000 at the time, but this was the start of quite a dramatic shift in policy over the next 20 years, whereby students were expected to make significantly larger contributions towards the cost of their higher education. The most notable of these changes, of course, was in 2012, when the cap on tuition fees was increased from £3,000 to £9,000. Now, the interesting thing about that reform is that the government expected the cap not to be the limit or the level at which everybody set their fees. They thought that universities would start to compete on price and we'd actually see a driving down of the average price somewhere below that level. That didn't materialize, and today what we have is almost all universities setting fees of the current cap, £9,250, for all of their courses. So the subject of my talk, of course, is whether this system is fair. Now, fairness is a really tricky concept. It's very subjective and it's very difficult, particularly for an economist. So I'm not going to go as far as to be able to tell you a definitive answer to this question, but what I hope I will be able to do is to give you a bunch of evidence and a series of points that will help you to think about the debate and decide what your answer to this question is. Of course, this issue is still very topical. It was only less than 2 years ago that Jeremy Corbyn surprised everybody by being very successful in running on a ticket of scrapping tuition fees for everybody. This prompted a major government review of the current system, which is going on at the moment. And I'm going to talk about some of the issues that are being considered by that review. So as Nick mentioned, broadly speaking, there are two sides to this debate. It's very polarized. There's this group who, as Nick mentioned, believe that education is a right, it should be free, that marketization of higher education causes all sorts of problems, has lots of negative effects, including barriers, particularly which harm access for poor kids going to university. Now, this is Karl Marx, author of the Communist Manifesto. Now, you immediately think, as soon as I bring up a picture of Karl Marx, that he's going to be on the side of those guys I just showed. But the reality is not that. Karl Marx said, if higher education institutions are also free, that only means, in fact, defraying the cost of education of the bourgeoisie from the general tax receipts. In other words, higher education is heavily dominated by the rich, and it's unfair to make the general taxpayer pay for the rich people to go to university. Nick Barr himself puts this a little bit more succinctly, and perhaps a bit more bluntly: free is just another word for some other sucker pays. Now, people on this side of the argument will draw on statistics such as these ones. People from private schools are 4 times more likely to go to university than those on free school meals. They're also 20 times more likely to get into a Russell Group university. People on this side of the argument will also draw on the large private returns that people get from going to university. So a study by Ian Walker and Yu Zhu from a few years ago estimated what the impact of going to university was on your lifetime earnings. And they estimated for men, going to university added £170,000 to their lifetime earnings, compared to if they didn't go, on average, amongst the set of people who do go. For women, it was a bit higher, at about £250,000. So where should we stand when we think about these two sides of the debate? For the rest of this talk, I'm going to outline some basic concepts of fairness, and I'm going to talk then about how the current system does in terms of getting at these concepts of fairness. So for the first of these concepts, here's Harrow. I want you to imagine Harvey from Harrow, who gets 3 B grades at A level. I'm now going to cut to the Harris Academy in Battersea. This is actually one of the best secondary schools, state secondary schools in the country. But it takes a very large number of kids from very poor backgrounds. I want you to imagine Jessica from the Harris Academy, who also gets 3 B grades at A-level. Now, my first concept of fairness would be that I think that Jessica's background, i.e. coming from a family which wouldn't be able to pay for tuition fees, should not make her any less likely to go to university than Harvey. So my first concept is, is that financial means should not be a barrier to access. For my second concept, I'm going to introduce this very basic framework where I'm thinking about the returns to higher education. I'm going to talk about the private returns, i.e. those that accrue to the individual, and the social returns, i.e. those that accrue to society. So an example of a social return might be a graduate who does cancer research, comes up with a cure for cancer. Society benefits much more widely than the individual would. And to fill out this framework, let's go back to Harvey from Harrow. Let's imagine Harvey does business marketing, takes a job with a global cigarette company, and makes a fortune advertising cigarettes in emerging markets around the world. Now, I don't think anyone's going to be strongly disagreeing with me when I say that I'm going to put Harvey in this high private returns, low social returns box. I'm also going to make the claim that I think that it's unfair that Harvey's education should be subsidized by the taxpayer. So my second concept of fairness is that, when there are low social benefits and high private benefits, the individual should at least make a contribution towards their higher education, but ideally a significant one. For my third concept, I'm going to go back to Jessica at the Harris Academy, and I'm going to imagine that she decides she wants to do a social care degree. Now, a social care degree does not typically result in very high earnings, it's fair to say. But Jessica, people would argue that there are strong social benefits to somebody doing a social care degree. Further, Jessica is from a household where nobody's been to higher education before. She lives in an area where not very many people go. And people would also argue that there are wider benefits to Jessica going to higher education beyond those that accrue to her. And so in this case, Jessica is going to fit into this high social returns, low private returns box. So my third concept of fairness is that in the case of Jessica, i.e. when there's high social benefits and low private benefits, that the taxpayer should contribute. Now, just to complete this box, I'm first going to introduce Charlie from Harrow, who decides to do David Beckham studies at university, which still I think is going to have low private returns and is definitely going to have low social returns. I'm also going to introduce Alex, also from the Harris Academy, who decides to go into cancer research. She's going to do pretty well financially for herself, but there are also wider benefits to society from her going to university. Now, I would say it's fairly clear-cut that I think that there's not a good case for the taxpayer to be subsidizing Charlie's exploits, but there is one potentially for Alex. That's actually quite a slippery area of fairness, and I'm not going to talk about it in too much detail. There's really good arguments on both sides, both that the taxpayer should contribute and that Alex should contribute. I'm actually going to focus the majority of the talk on the other cases of this little framework. Okay, so I'm now going to talk about each of these individual concepts and how well the system does at addressing them. So the first of these is that financial means should not be a barrier to access. So of course, £9,250 tuition fees sounds like a lot of money, and that it may well be a barrier. If there weren't any student loans, then it almost certainly would be a significant barrier. But there are student loans. In the early 1990s, the government set up the student loan company to provide people with credit to be able to go to university. The student loan company will give everybody from the UK a loan to cover 100% of their tuition fees if they study in the UK. They'll also cover, to an extent, people's living costs. These living cost loans will go up to about £10,000. Combined with the interest that accrues to people's loans, and I'm sure people will be very aware of that, this leads to average debts of around £50,000 on graduation from a 3-year degree. A significant sum of money. But the really crucial thing, of course, is that these loans are income contingent. That means that you only have to pay 9% of your income above £25,000 for up to 30 years, at which point all loans are written off. So how does this work in practice? I'm going to now introduce a very simple age earnings profile. I'm going to flip between using income and earnings here just to simplify issues. Now this is a person who enters the labour market at age 22 on a £10,000 salary, quickly whips up to £50,000 and then stays there for the rest of their life. Now that's nice and simple, but reality is never really like that. Let's take Jessica and look at her age earnings profile. So she leaves the university, she gets a decent job, gets up to a £35,000 salary by the age of 24, which is pretty good going. But then she thinks, actually, I'm going to do a PhD. Her income plummets to 0 for 3 years while she does that, and then she lands herself a nice job where she quickly gets to 50 grand. But then she loses that job for whatever reason, heads into part-time work, has some kids, doesn't end up working full-time again until in her 40s, and when she ends up at a salary of £30,000. So what do her income contingent loan repayments look like? Well, she has to pay 9% of her income above £25,000. And you see that there are only 3 periods of her life where she has to make any repayments at all. Those are in her mid-20s, in her early 30s, and are in her late 40s. What happens to her debt? What happens to her debt? Well, she barely makes any inroads to her debt at all. It's all just written off when she gets to 30 years after leaving university. So it's this kind of example that makes headlines such as this really great for people who work in this area. Student loans are worse than a mortgage because graduates will carry debt for 30 years and never fully repay it. I mean, this is annoyingly stupid, but let me just elaborate on this a little bit. Let's say Jessica decides to borrow £50,000 from a mortgage company instead of from the student loan company. If she gets it at 2%, which historically is a pretty good rate, over a 30-year repayment period, the mortgage company will add on all the interest and then divide repayments up so they're the same every month for the entire mortgage period. I.e., Jessica is going to have to pay £185 per month, every month, for 30 years. Now let's look at what her cumulative repayments look like under this schedule. It's linear because she's paying exactly the same amount every year. I'm not doing any discounting or anything like that here. She's just paying £185 every month, all the way through for 30 years until she finishes paying £66,000 back in her mortgage. Compare that to her student loan repayments, and it makes this headline look quite ridiculous. She pays less than £10,000 over the course of her lifetime, and crucially, the mortgage repayments are completely unaffected by what's going on in Jessica's life. She loses her job, she has kids, she does a PhD, it doesn't matter, she's got to pay that mortgage. Under the income contingent loan system, the repayments stop when she drops below that £25,000 level. So I just want to emphasize the importance of the insurance value of student loans. it's not just that they provide everybody with credit to be able to go to university in the first place, it's also the fact that they insure you against bad outcomes in the labour market. And that's really important for thinking about when people are deciding whether or not to go to university. Universities are really you can be thought of as a very risky endeavour, particularly if you're taking on a lot of debt, because there's a good chance that you're not going to end up with a good labour market outcome. The income contingent loan system is there to stop people deciding not to go to university because of that risk. Okay, so let's go back to these statistics that I gave you at the beginning of private school kids being way more likely to go to university than kids who are on free school meals. Now, these numbers are actually taken from before 2012, so before the big increase in tuition fees. And actually, studies, I'm not going to go into the detail of how they do it, but they show that the gaps are almost entirely explained by attainment at age 16. I.e., once you allow for the fact that people on free school meals have on average lower attainment at 16 than people from private schools, their probability of going to universities is the same. This suggests that while there are big issues in access to university, those issues are being generated earlier in the school system and not by the details of the higher education system. Okay, this is all before the 2012 reform. So the burning question here is what happened in 2012? And the clicker's slowly going to tell you. Okay. So what this shows is what's happened to enrollments overall, first-year enrollments in full-time undergraduate degrees over the 2003 to 2015 period. 2012, of course, is when the reforms happened. And yes, there was a bit of readjustment around these reforms. In fact, it seems that quite a lot of people were going a bit earlier because they didn't want to have a gap year and pay the £9,000 fees. And so this made a lower number of people go the next year. But then after that, numbers recovered back to basically normal. And in fact, once you adjust for the fact that the cohort sizes were slightly different before and after the reform, just because of normal demographic changes, actually the proportion of people overall going to higher education didn't really change. So we see that here. So this is the overall change in participation comparing before the reform to after the reform. And we actually see that it went up by nearly 3 percentage points overall on a baseline of about 40. So this is initial entry to higher education. So crucially, how did this break down by socioeconomic background? Well, for privately educated people, actually, it slightly went down. I mean, basically a zero effect. There was nothing going on amongst the privately educated. For everyone else, we saw a fairly large increase, or a similar increase to the overall effect, as you'd expect, because this is the bulk of the population. But then for people who are on free school meals, so this is something like the poorest 15% of the country, their participation actually increased the most through the reform. So it's these kind of numbers that have led many politicians to say things like the gap between the rich and poor going to higher education, if anything, has reduced through the 2012 reforms. And this does seem to back up this line of argument. So overall, when we're thinking about participation in full-time education, we've not really seen much of a change. But when we're looking at part-time, we get quite a significantly different story. So this isn't, I've not just been messing around with the scales here. This is a big drop in part-time participation. Now the thing to notice here is that this started before the 2012 reform. And that's because actually back in 2009, people were now no longer able to get access to student loans if they were doing a second degree, which actually makes up for a lot of part-time education. And so people started dropping out, and then when the fees went up, they really started dropping out very quickly, and ultimately there's been a halving in the number of part-time students. Just to back up the case that this is primarily for people going back and doing second degrees, I'm just going to show a fact about the distribution of people's ages when they're receiving degrees. So this shows that the 25th percentile of people receiving degrees between 2001 and 2008 was about 22 years old, i.e. 25% of people were about 22 or younger when they received their first degree. Sorry, not first degree, when they were receiving a degree. 50% of people were about 24 or younger, and 75% of people were 35 or younger, i.e. 25% of people were older than 35 when they were receiving a degree. In the next period, we get a very similar distribution, but when we move to 2015, or since 2015, we see that the long tail in the ages of people getting degrees has just vanished, i.e. there are way fewer older people getting degrees since 2015. I mean, this fact just aligns with the big drop in part-time participation that we've seen. But it's really important to emphasize that when we're thinking about what the impact of the 2012 system was, we see that the student loan system mostly protected participation in full-time education from being affected. But once you don't have the student loan system, you see that there are really dramatic effects. Okay, so I'm now going to move on to the second concept of fairness, i.e. that low social benefits and high private benefits mean that the individual should pay. I'm going to go back to Harvey, the cigarette manufacturer, no, advertiser, sorry. And let's say that this is his age earnings profile. So he starts on £10,000 as well, but he quickly accelerates up to £80,000 and settles there for the rest of his life. Well, what do his repayments look like? Well, he has to pay 9% above the threshold. So they look like this. But, of course, his debt declines very quickly, and he actually ends up paying much faster than that. So he stops paying altogether by his late 30s. So how do Harvey's repayments look compared to Jessica's? Well, we already saw Jessica's cumulative lifetime repayments. These are Harvey's, so he's paying nearly £60,000 in nominal terms. So what this implies is the system is highly progressive in the way that it charges people. To show this, I'm now going to line everybody up based on how much they earn over their lifetime. So we have the poorest 10% of people over here and the richest 10% of people over here. And I'm going to plot the average lifetime repayments. This is now discounted for the eagle-eyed. Okay. So this is Jessica. She's towards the lower end of the lifetime earnings distribution, and she doesn't make very large repayments. This is where Harvey is. He's towards the top end of the lifetime earnings distribution, and he makes high repayments. This is what the rest of the population looks like. Pretty simple. But we see that this confirms that the system is highly progressive, i.e. those who earn the most following university repay by far the most when they leave. Now let's go back to this idea about scrapping tuition fees. Now you've got to remember that if you scrap tuition fees, you still have maintenance debt, so you're still going to have to make student loan repayments. But let's see what it does to the distribution. So what we see is, for Jessica, it doesn't actually make any difference to her repayments. She earns so little that she wouldn't get through her maintenance debt anyway, so it doesn't matter how much you charge her for tuition fees. The person who's really benefiting here is Harvey and people of his, in his kind of group. He benefits a very significant amount in terms of how much he repays over his lifetime. And this is an important point to keep in mind. I'm now going to introduce an idea that people often raise when they think about the student loan system and the fact that there are positive interest rates on student debt. And to explore this point, I'm going to bring in Natalie, who has a similar age earnings profile to Harvey, but less stellar. She's sort of somewhere in the £55,000 by her late 20s and settles there. So this is what her repayments are like. She basically dead weights her debt. She repays it just on the last day. So there's nothing written off, but she's repaying for 30 years. Now let's compare her cumulative lifetime repayments to the others, and we see that Natalie's actually repaying more than Harvey, despite the fact that she earns less over her lifetime. So this often is referred to as a regressive system, i.e. people who earn less are actually paying more. But the reality of this is that it's not actually that big of a deal in the system. I think when I'm talking about the context of fairness in the system, it's an important point to raise, but the practicality of it is that it's not really that important. Let me just show Natalie if I just tweak her earnings. Sorry, this is not working well. If I just tweak her earnings down to £45,000 per year instead of £55,000 a year. So we see there's actually a very dramatic change in how much debt she has written off. And we see that this knocks her lifetime repayments to below that of Harvey's. So the reality is that really you've got to be repaying your debt for this regressive system to kick in. And in practice, amazingly, only 17% are forecast to fully repay their loans. That's if they follow the repayment schedule. So the regressive features only apply amongst the very top earners, i.e. the top 17% of graduate earners. Now another issue that's often raised is that, okay, well, you may not get this regressivity in terms of the scheduled repayments very often. But what is possible is that people from richer households are able to just pay their loans up front, and then they don't incur any interest. And so they end up paying less than people from poorer households who earn less than them. Now the problem is that being in the top 17% for these people is very unpredictable. Some people will know for sure that they're going to be in the top 17% of graduate earnings, but for most people that's not very certain at all. And so the government's actually not that worried about people paying all of their tuition fees up front, because the practical reality is that they're probably going to make more from them than they would have done had they just made repayments through the student loan system. So I don't think this interest rate regressivity thing is a huge issue to do with fairness. And what I'd say is the key feature here is the student loan system is highly progressive. i.e., we're hitting this second point of low social benefits and high private benefits under the current system. So on to my third point. This was when there are high social benefits and low private benefits, the taxpayer should contribute. So let's think back to Jessica and her social care degree. Now we saw that Jessica only paid less than £10,000 of her £50,000 debt. In other words, she receives a student loan subsidy from the government of more than 80%. So you might say, great, we're doing it well. Jessica's got low private returns, high social returns, the government's heavily subsidizing her degree. But we have a problem. Charlie. So Charlie and his David Beckham studies. If Charlie has exactly the same age earnings profile as Jessica, he will receive exactly the same student loan subsidy in excess of 80%. Because as I said at the beginning, fees are the same for everybody. What recent IFS work that I've been involved with has done is estimated how loan subsidies vary by subject area studied. We know that different subject areas result in very different earnings. So here's a bunch of subject areas. Unfortunately, David Beckham studies is not sufficiently large to get a reasonable sample, but we have a bunch of subject areas here. So for economics, we estimate that there's a loan subsidy of about 22%. For engineering, it's more like 40%. Now for the creative arts, it's actually 76%. So creative arts are courses like art, drama, dance, but also lots of design type courses. Now, on average, they have the lowest earnings of any of these subject areas, and they consequently get the largest loan subsidies. This just fills out the rest of this chart. Overall, the government has an average loan subsidy of around 50%, which sounds probably higher than you might have expected. So it expects to write off about 50% of all the student loans that it issues. This equates to spending, if once you include grant spending as well, this equates to spending of about £9,000 per student per year. This is actually about 50% more than the government spends on secondary education. That's about £6,000 per student per year, which is kind of alarming actually when you think that the rhetoric around this system is that it's heavily contribution based from the students. So while you've got a £9,000 sticker price, the government's actually stumping up a lot of money. Now the point that I was making here is that this number varies considerably by the subject that people study. So for economics, which is one of the highest earning subject area, we estimate that it's about £3,500 for the government per student per year. For engineers, it's more like £7,000 per student per year, while for creative arts, it's something like £12,000. Now, I want to be really clear. My point here is not that creative arts is full of Charlies. It's not that. Instead, it's a little bit more subtle, and it's that under the current system, whereby you have flat tuition fees, and almost no other forms of government spending, there's very little government control about where that money is going. Let me just elaborate on that slightly. So this is the distribution of government spending in the 2011 system, so before the 2012 reforms. You see, at this time, roughly 60% of upfront government spending was in loans and 40% was in grants. Now, grants can be used at the government's discretion. They can give them to poorer kids. They can target certain subject areas. They can do what they want with them. Under the current system, about 95% of upfront government spending is on loans. Now these loans, as I said, are basically invariant across different subjects. Aside from different course lengths, they're basically invariant because of the lack of variation in tuition fees. And so consequently, the government spending on higher education is very heavily dominated by loan subsidies, which is going to the low earning subject areas. So to put this more succinctly, Martin McKillen in The Guardian wrote, "Never mind the students, tuition fees are a bad deal for the taxpayer." So is the system fair? Well, we talked through financial means being a barrier to access, and I've argued that there's not very strong evidence that the current tuition fee system puts people from poorer households off from going to university. And that's heavily driven by the design of the student loan system. When you don't have the loans, you do get serious responses to changes in fees. I've also shown that when there are low social benefits and high private benefits, in the case of Harvey, that the individual does indeed pay more. And again, I've shown that when there are high social benefits and low private benefits, the taxpayer is contributing a lot. But I just want to return to this framework that I introduced earlier. So what I said at the beginning was I think that there's a very strong case for Jessica to be subsidised. And I also think there is a good case, not everybody would agree with this, but there is a good case for Alex to be subsidised. But under the design of the current student loan system, what you find is that the system is unable to distinguish between Alex and Harvey. And it's also unable to distinguish between Jessica and Charlie, i.e. the spending is just heading to where the earnings are low, not to where the social returns are high. Now, what could the government do about this? Well, one option would be to move back towards a grant-based system. So you could cut tuition fees, bring back more grants, target those grants where you want them to go. But the drawback of that is that, as I've showed, that dramatically reduces the progressivity of the system, which means that higher earning people like Harvey end up benefiting considerably from cuts to tuition fees like that. This is one of the issues that is being heavily grappled with by the government at the moment as it considers its position on tuition fees. And that's where I'm going to finish. Thanks.
Well, thanks, Jack. That was terrific. I said you had a treat in store for you. Before turning it over to you, I'd like to make a couple of points, and then I want to put a question to Jack. Couple of sound bites that I've used in debate. One is, why should the truck driver pay for the degree of the old Etonian? Another one is, students get it free, it's graduates who repay. I have two pet peeves. One of them, I have to say, I think Jack fell into, which is the use of the word debt. When you talk about debt, if my kid had a £50,000 credit card debt, I would have sleepless nights. But this isn't credit card debt, as Jack's explained. It's income contingent repayments. It's a payroll deduction, like income tax and national insurance contributions, and for most people, smaller than either of those. So it's not something that ought to cause sleepless nights. And Martin Lewis has argued that we should move away from the terminology of fees and loans and debt, and instead call it a higher education contribution or something like that. My other pet peeve, Jack has illustrated very much lurid tabloid headlines. It's a great headline to say, 50,000, you're being a bastard to students, this is worse than a mortgage. This scares people off. This is scaremongering, and that is profoundly unhelpful. A great way to mark an essay is to criticize it for something that the essay didn't, for not being another essay. And what you've heard is a great presentation about fairness. I'd like to raise one or two broader issues. And one of them is, as Jack said, in 2012, the tuition fee cap went up from £3,000 a year to £9,000 a year. As a result, universities suddenly had shed loads of money. And the question is, did they spend that on glitzy new buildings, pyramids for vice-chancellors, or has this actually improved the quality of teaching for you guys, the students? And sort of maybe we should start reflecting a little bit on, what the new regime has done for students or has not done for students.
Okay, so to start the answer to that, I should say that the average increase for university funding was about 25% through the reform. So they were indeed a lot better off. Now, I think one of the key issues here is that measuring university quality is actually quite difficult. It's not like with schools where you have a bunch of inputs, so you know the grades of people going in, and a bunch of national exams where you know the grades of people coming out, and you can see how schools are doing in terms of their inputs and their outputs. University outputs are not so clear-cut because they basically award their own degrees. So it's not like everybody's following the same national standard in terms of in terms of outcomes. So it's quite difficult to look at quality. People have instead gone to things like the National Student Survey to see if people are happier with the quality of teaching that they're receiving. And to be honest, there's not any evidence of a change in 2012 at all. Another place I thought it would be good to look for the answer to this question, I was going to have a section on this, was in the World University Rankings. And actually there were headlines recently saying, oh, British universities are doing really well now in the university rankings. So this is evidence that the recent reforms have been great. Actually, the number of universities in the top 20, the top 50, the top 100 and the top 500 is exactly the same now as it was in 2011, 2010, 2009. There's basically been no change in terms of the international rankings. So I think one of the issues here is that you can't really measure quality. The bad measures that we have, there doesn't seem to be any evidence of an improvement. And so what you get is universities starting to compete in other ways. So the idea that you've said of universities starting to spend a lot of money on fancy halls and gyms and all of this sort of thing, there is some evidence of this. And I think part of that is a problem with them being able to tell the student that they're a good university. And so they start to compete for students by spending on nice infrastructure and things like that, and that's their way of attracting students. Another example, actually, sorry to not be very concise here, but another example is in the recent rise in unconditional offers. I think this is a really important phenomenon. It's gone from basically less than 2% of people being offered unconditional offers to around 25% of people being offered unconditional offers. And huge rises in some subject areas and at some sort of ability levels. And again, I think this is evidence of competition between universities for students, but not really in a way that the government was intending in 2012 when it made these changes. It thought that big increases in fees would make students more discerning and universities would start competing on teaching quality. And I think you're actually kind of getting some distortions whereby they're competing on other metrics.
I was at a conference a few years ago and I heard the president of one of the American Ivy League universities using an expression that electrified me. It's time, she said, to call a halt to the amenities arms race. And this is things like, student accommodation should be warm and secure and with decent food and with good internet access. It doesn't have to be in buildings that win international architecture competitions, and I think that is a potential problem. Another potential problem that I think could be a reflection of increased competition is concern about grade inflation. I was advising a House of Lords committee that was doing a report on post-school education, and the committee heard some dramatic evidence about how the number of 2-1s and firsts had shot up dramatically at some universities and hardly at all at others. Now, is this also part of the picture?
Almost certainly it is. I think it's slightly more nuanced than that. It's not only universities saying, hey, look, you're very likely to get a 2-1 or a first if you come here, but it's also universities worrying about graduate outcomes, which are increasingly becoming part of the picture for universities when they're in the way the government measures them. And I think in the short run, it's very possible that universities are thinking, well, if we knock these people up to 2-1s, then they might be more likely to get a job, and these are the way that we're measured in the short run. So I think, yeah, it's very related at this point.
At risk of harming LSE recruitment, it's something that gives me some satisfaction that year after year at examiners' meetings, the external examiners from other universities always beat us up for being too stingy with our grades. So there's not great inflation everywhere, but I think it is something of a concern. This is bringing out the general question. The 2012 reforms were introduced in the hope of strengthening market forces. And do you agree that that hasn't worked as well as its somewhat naive proponents had hoped?
It's very clear that that it hasn't gone as expected. The most notable example of that is the fact that the government very clearly expected there to be competition on fees, and that hasn't happened. And I think a lot of the things that I've talked about here give you clues as to why that's the case, i.e., people don't really repay these fees anyway. Increasing your student debt from £42,000 to £50,000 is very unlikely to make a difference to you. It's way in the distance anyway, even if it does make a difference to you. And in the short run, if you think, well, if I'm paying £8,000 instead of £9,000, maybe I'm not getting that nice hall of residence, or maybe I'm not getting that nice gym because the university's not got as much cash. So yeah, I think this is kind of my general point here, is that the reforms didn't go as expected, and the expected thing was that marketisation would result in universities competing on teaching quality.
So a general lesson for you all to take away is competition is great and it works in a great many circumstances, low-cost airlines, smartphones, restaurants. It doesn't work everywhere, and one should be thoughtful about where and how one introduces it. There's one other area that I'd be interested in hearing a bit more information from you, Jack. You were talking about, you just hinted at the use of outcome data to measure university quality. Now, could I invite you to spend a bit more time talking about that, because that really, that matters enormously to you guys, knowing which universities generate which outcomes.
Yeah, this is going to look horribly staged, but I have a couple of slides on this topic. Just actually on the next slide, would you believe? So I to be honest, I thought you guys would like this, but I couldn't really fit it into my narrative. So I'm gonna just show you some results from.
This is a sneaky way of getting a bit of extra time for the speaker.
So what we've done is use new linked administrative data to try to estimate the causal returns of going to university. Now that's quite a hard problem, and so far we've only been able to do it up to age 29. So we can estimate how much better off you are as a result of going to university at age 29. For women, what we estimate is at age 29 we have average returns of about 26%, i.e. women who go to university have earned 26% more than they would have done had they not gone to university. But this shows how this return varies by subject. So we get economists earning 60% more than they would have done had they not gone, medics earning nearly 80% more, but down at the bottom end we've got agriculture, social care, psychology, and creative arts earning about 8% more than if they hadn't gone to university. Now for men, the picture's a lot less rosy, and we actually have several degrees that reduce earnings by age 29. The basic ordering here is very similar, but yeah, everything is just shifted down compared to women. And I just wanted to show how this looks for different universities. So I divided them up into different university groups. This like other universities are like dance colleges and kind of a miscellaneous category. There's the new post-1992 universities, the pre-92 universities. So these are the older universities outside the Russell Group, and then these are the returns for the Russell Group. And we see that some universities dramatically increase the earnings of women, while there are some that actually reduce earnings. I just added Manchester on here. So actually the Russell Group in general, it dominates the raw earnings data, but it also dominates the conditional earnings data, i.e. what the returns are to going to a Russell Group university. Now for men, again, we just get this shifting down in the system, in everything. So there are way more universities with apparently negative returns, and the ordering is very similar. And again, Manchester is somewhere towards the bottom of the Russell Group. Okay, so this is an extremely elongated answer to the question, which is using these outcomes as a measure of quality. Now, I think actually Manchester's positioning in this gets at a very important point here, and that is at the moment we don't have where you work if you once you leave university. So we're just looking at annual income, and we're looking at how much your annual income is affected by going to university. And while we can control from where you come from, we don't control for where you end up. And so Manchester graduates typically still will work in the northwest, excuse me. Maybe the northeast as well, which kind of reduces their sort of position in this chart. So I would say that in answer to the question, which was using these as measures of quality, I think that it's a dangerous game to use them use them sort of directly as a measure of quality. But I do think there are things that you can take from this information, i.e. down at the bottom end, we're getting a bunch of universities which are apparently reducing the earnings of men by the age 29. So that's the men who are doing those degrees are earning less than we think they would have done had they not gone, i.e. those universities are not producing earnings for their graduates that they should have done given how good their qualifications were when they came in. Now, I'm not saying that those universities should be shut down or something stupid like that, but I'm saying those universities should probably be looked at. Like, if you're performing way worse than you should be performing, conditional on who you're taking in, I think that's grounds to look at how well you're doing on all sorts of other aspects, like how many people are in your teaching classes, how good are your teachers, what are your careers advice services and things like that. That's not that dissimilar to what goes on in schools. If you get a Progress 8 score below a certain threshold, the inspectors are sent in to look at your school, and I think that these kind of metrics could be used in a similar way in universities.
I mean, a couple of points about these metrics. First of all, clearly what one really wants to know, not from your point of view, you want to know that, but from a public policy point of view, you want to know about value added. I mean, you could argue that Jessica's 3 Bs at A-level from a school in Battersea represented much greater value added by the school than Harvey's from Harrow. But there's another point, which is these figures of necessity measure only the money returns to doing a degree. And the money returns are important, but they're most emphatically only part of the story. I mean, what they leave out, first of all, is the enjoyment of the process of being a student, which can be fairly horrible come exam time, but a lot of students also do enjoy their time at university. It leaves out job satisfaction. When I meet my ex-students, they're not all of them making shed loads of money, far from it, but disproportionately, they really enjoy their work. And if I were to give you any advice, it would be job satisfaction is priceless. Not waking up on a Monday morning with a sinking feeling in the pit of your stomach is worth a huge amount, and these figures don't capture that. There's one other point, and this is one that requires wisdom in the way these data are used. You get politicians saying universities whose graduates don't earn enough should be fined or shut down or beaten up in some way. If you make the incentive for universities to be concerned about their earnings of their graduates too high, what are they going to do? They're going to cherry pick. They're going to pick the students who are going to earn the most. So they're going to expand their business studies department and shrink their music department. They're going to try to have fewer women students. Women have lower earnings than men. Part of it is gender pay gap. Part of it is other things. We've seen this from Jack's data. So if you put too much emphasis on this, you end up creating discrimination against women. And final point, example from US healthcare. Exactly the same point about cherry picking. Medical insurance companies try to recruit healthy people. So you hear stories about insurance companies where you have to apply for the policy in person on the 4th floor of a building that has no lift. So I would worry about cherry picking as well.
Can I respond to that? Sorry. So I mean, you're slightly confusing some issues here. This is estimating the value added.
Oh, great. Okay.
So it is adjusting for the composition of students. It's comparing women with women who didn't go to university. It's comparing people with certain A-level grades compared to people who didn't go to university with similar A-level grades, for example. So that kind of, while your point is still relevant, it mutes it a bit because it's harder to game a system to get high value added than it is to game a system just to get the highest earnings, if you see what I mean.
Yes.
But I mean, it does raise some more subtle issues, like the University of Manchester might pick people who live on the M6 because the people who live on the M6 are more likely to go to London. Sorry, I'm making this up, but They might choose particular types of people because they do particularly well in these kind of outcomes. As soon as you start having these metrics as outcomes for universities, they're going to be there to be gamed, and they'll try and figure out ways to manipulate them in some way that may cause bad distortions. But I think this is a whole lot better than just using raw earnings data, which I agree would be very dangerous.
I will pose a third question, but park it, because we should open this up to the audience. But if there's time, one of the things you said was only 17% of borrowers repay their loan in full. And it's an interesting question. Is that good loan design or bad loan design? But I shall park that. Questions? There's a roving mic. So if you put up your hand if you've got a question, please ask questions. And if I could encourage those of you without grey hair to ask questions as well.
Hello, I'm Peter Folkman. I'm a layperson here. I wonder if I might tempt you a little more, both of you, to talk about, I've written down here policy failure. What I noticed that you were both talking about is you had a marketization of the student market, the university market, and we expected, or the government expected, certain things to happen that they thought the market would improve, some objectives. Now, I share and I notice a certain skepticism as to whether the market will improve anything, but what were the policy objectives, and is this a policy failure? In the very big picture, what were we trying to do, and has it achieved it? Well, probably not. But what were the policy objectives of this?
So the 2012 reform was heavily driven by the Brown Review, which was written just before it. If you read the Brown Review, it's very clear that there are two main things that it's worried about. One is that when you have university finances as part of government finances, it's almost inevitable that they get squeezed, because every couple of years there's a spending review and everybody is fighting to get their voice heard. And ultimately, university investment is a long-run thing, and historically you've seen very clear patterns of downward trends as student numbers have increased, that funding per head has declined until you get a reform and then it bumps up. And what the Brown Review was trying to do was ring fence funding so that it was directly linked to the student. And it argued that if you have something like a graduate tax, then those tax receipts go into the general coffers from HMRC. There's a big debate about what to do with those returns from the graduate tax. And then ultimately university finances get squeezed. And so that was a really key aim of it. And in that sense, this reform has been extremely successful. In fact, a lot more successful than it expected to be. It's ring-fenced money for universities, but it's actually increased them by way more than it thought would happen. The other thing was that it really talks a lot about the rise of international university competition and how universities are one of the biggest sources of pride in the UK. We punch above our weight in terms of the university quality, and this was a way to bring in competitive incentives that would ensure that quality was maintained. So let me just explain one of the key reasons it thought that quality might be harmed. So under the old system, aside from student funding per head, there was an additional problem in that the government would set caps on student numbers. And so universities were just filling up their spots every year. There's way excess demand. And there was a concern that they're just filling up, they don't need to worry about attracting students. It was thought that once students started having to repay £9,000, they would A, be able to remove the caps on student numbers because there's less money coming from the taxpayer and more from the students. And B, the students would start making universities respond and drive in terms of quality. And that's the bit that I would say has not been so successful, because universities are competing in kind of ways that they didn't really expect.
I mean, the idea behind it, I mean, my piece of empirical evidence, in 1979, yes, I can remember it, the Thatcher government withdrew all taxpayer support for overseas students. So all of a sudden, universities like LSE, where we've always had about a third of our students from overseas, had to charge tuition fees to our overseas students, and we had to go out and recruit them. So students came from overseas, and they paid LSE checks, and guess what happened? We started to be nice to them. If academics skipped their office hours, the student would complain to the director, who would talk to the head of department, who'd beat up the academic. So I've actually watched our act improving over the years as a response to students bringing tuition fees. And that's the thinking behind it. And competition in principle can be useful, but it needs to be regulated competition, not free market competition, and it needs to be in terms of the right things. And if it's in terms of the wrong things, then you get bad outcomes.
Thanks. Going back to the same era, 79 to 82, which is when I was at Manchester, I remember, given your first slide, busloads of students going off to London to complain that their student grant wasn't nearly high enough. So they didn't have any debts. They were given them enough money to live in a year as long as you lived in crappy accommodation. And their self-interest was still such that they would go on these demonstrations. Point one. But the other thing that strikes me comparing now to that era is we're still doing 3-year courses in almost every subject. I don't understand why that is the case. Why would students in certain courses want to study for 3 years? I'm not talking about compressed 3-year courses to 2-year courses. Why do they have to be 3 years long for almost all subjects? And employers as well, presumably, would have their own interests in terms of, well, would rather get them earlier and perhaps some sort of subsidy from the government to help.
Yeah, this is something that it's an example of innovation that the government was expecting when it brought in the reforms. I mean, the truth is the current system is a relic of a very, very old school Oxbridge system, and everybody's followed that model, and that's sort of the steady state, and nobody's jumped out of it. But there's not really a good reason for that. In terms of delivery of quality, there's other reasons that it's happened, like the power of lecturers and things like that. But yeah, the government was expecting this sort of thing to happen, and there was a lot of talk about it at the time. In reality, I think that it seems that it's only really going to happen from kind of the alternative providers, the new private institutions. And that's where you are seeing this sort of innovation to happen. New institutions are offering shorter courses with condensed teaching periods and things like that. But personally, as that takes off, I think this sort of thing is almost inevitable in the future.
There's a constraint that's stopping it happening as well. Funding is per year per full-time equivalent student. And what one needs is funding per academic unit. So a student doing a short 3-unit course pays fees just for that course, and then you can build it up. So you need credit transfer along the lines of the US, and I'm sure that's going to come. When it comes, I think then the dike's going to burst and there's going to be massive reform, and quite rightly so. But I think the funding needs to open that up. At the moment, it's stopping it.
So you highlighted how there's a potential issue with Charlie, and I was wondering whether there's sort of an inverse relationship between social benefits and private benefits, and if there's really any way to measure social benefits from a degree, because that could potentially deal with the issues.
It's a good question. I think Nick and I were actually chatting about something like this on the way here, and I think this is the fundamental issue. It's just so hard to measure social benefits in a convincing way. There's lots of academic evidence in this area, but it's all kind of piecemeal, and it doesn't get at the fundamental question which you're trying to get at there, which is what are the social advantages of particular types of degrees. I just think that's never really going to happen. We can only ever build the evidence base to support an argument, but I don't think we're ever going to be at a point where we can say this is the quantifiable social benefit of this degree. I just think it's beyond realistic hope in terms of policy design. In terms of the inverse relationship, I don't know. That's I'm not sure what the answer to that is. I think that people coming from more deprived backgrounds are more likely to go on to have lower earnings. We see that in our administrative tax data, and I think there's a lot of very strong arguments that people from poorer backgrounds going to university have wider benefits to society. Again, these things are very hard to pick up, but I think that they are there. And so there's that kind of thing going on, but then I don't necessarily, I mean, one of my fundamental points here in my talk is that it's not necessarily the things with low earnings that always have the high social benefits. You know, I could open up a degree right now and create David Beckham studies and charge £9,000, and there's a decent chance I'd get some students because, you know, I mean, actually this sort of thing happened in Australia, and they started bribing students to come. They say, okay, we'll give you an iPad if you sign up, because they're just never going to pay off their student loans. They're going up to sort of 50-year-olds in shopping centres and getting them to sign a form saying they'll pay 9,000 fees or equivalent. You know, there's no reason why those sorts of activities are good to society. So it's definitely, there's not a set rule that there's a, you know, low private benefits equal high social benefits.
Let me just give an illustration from healthcare first. You've got a health problem, you get medical treatment, you get better. Do you get better 100% because of the medical treatment? Or was the medical treatment irrelevant and you actually got better because you have innate powers of recovery? Or was it a mix of the two? So you come to Manchester, you get a really good degree. Is that all entirely because of the teaching you've received? Or is it partly because you're bright and you're hardworking and you've brought something to the party as well? The social returns to higher education, which includes both your private benefits and the additional benefits, is lower if part of it is your innate ability, and it's higher if it's partly due to your teaching. So, I mean, I agree with Jack. I think measuring the social benefits above the private benefits it would be wonderful to be able to do it, but I don't see it happening.
Hi. So in the run-up to the 2012 reforms, I understand the coalition government, one of the reasons why they were attracted to this system over a graduate tax was because this didn't count towards the government debt, whereas a graduate tax would have done. And the ONS has since reclassified that. And I wonder if in the sort of as the Auger review is coming and it's perhaps politically expedient to get away from the language of tuition fees and loans, whether there be any sort of change in the fairness if they move towards the graduate tax system over this.
Well, I actually wasn't expecting to get any questions on the accounting treatment of student loans in this talk. So that's right. It's the deficit that was the thing that the government was worried about. People will be familiar with the deficit because of the coalition government spent its entire time talking about how important it was to get rid of the deficit. And yeah, it's true that a graduate tax, for some pretty ridiculous reasons, did count towards the deficit because the government was effectively giving money to universities in a grant up front and was getting tax revenues later, and it couldn't call that a loan. Whereas when it calls it a loan, it didn't count towards the deficit, and the government really cared about this. And yeah, they've just changed the ruling so that any write-offs on student loans count towards the deficit today. It sounds quite dry, but it does actually have quite severe implications for government policy. And I think that in a world where government worries a lot about deficit, it's almost inevitable that it's going to accelerate changes that might have happened anyway. I should say, and I really want to be clear here, is that it doesn't change anything in reality at all about the system, the way that it's classified, and it shouldn't have any impact on policy at all. But I wouldn't be surprised if it does.
I mean, one of the drivers of the 2012 reforms was as Jack said, if you move from grants to loans, loans don't count against the deficit. So higher education is financed in terms of funny money, and that's one of the reasons why higher education was allowed to escape austerity. The problem is it means higher education has been financed on a bubble, and if I were a Vice-Chancellor, that would give me sleepless nights. And the fact that the Office for National Statistics has now decided that this is a crazy way to run the public accounts, so it looks as though it's going to be changed, which might involve a short-run hit for higher education finance, but it's undoubtedly for the long-run good of higher education. And if any of you is really wicked, I will explain to you the full details of how loans enter the public accounts, but my advice to you is don't go there.
I should actually say that Nick is one of the people heavily responsible for that change, so he knows it very well.
Yeah, hi. We've spoken a lot about the fairness of outcomes of what you pay for university and then what you go on to earn. Shouldn't there be some talk about the fairness of, say, someone doing a social science degree 10 hours a week pays £9,000 and someone doing 9 to 5 labs in a chemistry degree pays the same amount, and actually the social scientist is subsidising what the chemistry student is doing, and isn't that completely unfair?
Yeah, it's a good question. I basically wanted to try and talk about this in my in my narrative, and I struggled to get it in because there's so little information on the costs of providing teaching that I found it quite difficult to really make this point very, very clearly. I would say that in many cases, science degrees are associated with higher long-term returns than the social science degrees, and therefore the social scientists are not actually paying for the scientist degrees. It's the taxpayer that's paying, that's ultimately giving more money than it should to the social science degrees through this loan subsidy, and then that's getting reallocated by the university. It's only in the cases where people go on to earn a lot of money that they're ending up cross-subsidizing. I mean, fundamentally, I agree with you that that there is an argument that it's unfair for people to be overpaying for their degrees to cross-subsidize others. But ultimately, if you don't have that, then you will reduce the progressivity of the system and the money will have to come from the taxpayer.
Couple of points. One, there is still some additional taxpayer support for the more expensive subjects, the lab-based ones. So that reduces the extent of cross-subsidy. Secondly, tuition fees pay for teaching, but they pay for a lot of other things as well, the library, the labs, which again reduces the extent of unfairness. But the bottom line is, I agree with you, it's unfair, but not quite as unfair as it appears, just looking at the raw numbers.
I was wondering if you thought it might be a plausible solution for the government to change their strategy of price caps on tuition fees such that the degrees that they're currently subsidizing more in the long term, such as the creative arts, compared to something like economics, which is only 20 to 30%, they make universities charge less for them so that the taxpayer and the government in the end ends up subsidizing it less, and as a result it benefits them and maybe also increases competition for the people going for these less beneficial degrees, arguably. Or do you think the consequences are too negative of something like this?
I think what we should take from 2012 is that we don't really know how people are going to respond to policies. In this environment, it's complicated. Variable fees, as you talk about here, were very heavily considered, I understand, in the current government review, and I think that they've kind of taken a bit of a back door and they're now no longer a very prominent idea. I think one of the big reasons for that is because the response to the students is very unpredictable. I think there's a concern that people would want to do more of these courses with lower earnings, particularly perhaps people from who are less informed for whatever reason. So maybe people from households where nobody else has been to higher education and they don't know very much about it. And so you might get increases in demand for these cheaper, the lower fee courses because the sticker price is lower. There may be all sorts of other distortions, like if you took a load of money out of the university system, you'd no longer have this cross-subsidization going on from the creative arts or whatever to the science-based courses. And so actually that might mean that the universities are no longer able to offer these science-based courses, which would not be good for government's sort of strategy to increase STEM. And so I think that because the responses are so unpredictable and we know so little about the costs of provision at the moment, it's a very dangerous game to go down the road of setting variable fees. But having said that, they do have them in Australia and it works quite well.
Hi, I was just struck by your point that around the £9,000 per student per year overall subsidy that the government spends through people not repaying their loans, which links back to Nick's last point. And I can't help but think what the opportunity cost must be for that, because obviously you're not spending that money on healthcare or transport or anything else. And I can't help but think about that in the context of fairness. And also you've got this kind of demand-led system where people can kind of go to university, sign up for a student loan, whilst knowing that they're never really going to pay it back as well. And I'm kind of wondering whether that's kind of fair as well. So I was wondering if you could say a bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting point. That covers quite a bit of ground. The second thing that you're saying is almost, it's not that dissimilar to what I think about when I think about the policy of scrapping tuition fees altogether. You know, I remember when Labour said they were going to scrap tuition fees, I can't remember who it was, but one of the cabinet or shadow cabinet members was interviewed on what the details of the policy were going to be, and they said, "Okay, what are you going to do about student number caps?" And he just didn't know, and it was quite embarrassing, really, watching this interview. It was very clear that he didn't know, and the problem is that when you set fees too low, you get excess demand, and that either costs the government a fortune, which or you have to bring in student number caps. So that was the problem there. But when the issue with the current system is that you're getting at is you're almost suggesting, well, the threshold at which you start making repayments is so high that people almost treat it like they don't have any tuition fees, and then you get kind of excess demand again, essentially. And so that's just a trade-off that the government's constantly facing, the level at which to set that insurance level. So on one hand, it's really good in the example of Jessica that I gave, but on the other hand, it's at a very high level, and that may cause distortions. Just to give it a kind of number behind that, when Theresa May increased the threshold from £21,000 to £25,000 to the point at which you start making repayments, that increased the government cost by about a third, which is, almost mind-blowing. So, nobody would have expected a £4,000 increase in the policy in the threshold to have such a dramatic effect on the long-run cost of higher education. Just to put that in the context of wider policy, I don't want to get into non-education spending because I just don't know enough about it. Nick's the guy there, but that policy increased the long-run cost of higher education by £2.3 billion. The education maintenance allowance was £600 million. That's it. That's my answer.
But the increase in the threshold that cost 2.3 billion, it was 2.3 billion of funny money, not 2.3 billion of real money. That's why it happened. Look, they always say one should leave the party when it's at its best. I don't think that the booze has yet run out, but I don't think that Jack has to run off immediately. So if any of you have any burning questions, do come up afterwards. But I think we should wind it up here. Thank you for terrific questions. Thanks, Jack. I knew it was going to be good. It was good. Thanks ever so much. Thank you all for coming.